Hello, welcome to some video notes. These are our last notes for the grade 10 units. We'll be talking a lot of various topics today. We'll be getting into the actual process of fertilization, implantation, and the development of a fertilized egg into a fetus so that a person actually becomes pregnant and then leading to birth. Then we'll be getting into the topic of infertility. So what is it like? What are the reasons behind why people might not be able to reproduce? And then what methods do we have available to us that can help people be allowed to reproduce if they are infertile? And then we'll be talking about safe sex and birth control. So how do we not get pregnant? How do we not spread sexually transmitted diseases when being sexually active? And then we'll discuss a little bit about the pros and cons of using these different types of materials. You should be able to very well explain the different types of birth control methods and what are the pros and cons of each type. Okay.
So you get nothing. You lose. Good day, sir.
Starting off, if we're going to go through the process of fertilization, the first thing that has to happen is copulation. There has to be what we call sexual intercourse, or sex. So during sexual intercourse, typically there's an increase in heart rate, in breathing rate, respiratory rate, there's an increase in blood pressure, and also certain hormones will spike in both the male and female tissues in order to help with the process of their sexual organs going through the process of sex so that sperm can be released and so that they can start their journey to finding the egg. So one of the things that will happen, of course, is an erection, which means that there's an increased blood flow to the penis. The penis is mostly muscular tissue, but it is capable of being engorged or being filled with extra amounts of blood from the circulatory system. And so at most times when the penis is not erect, there is a normal amount of blood flow through it, but not an excessive amount. During intercourse, the reason why the penis becomes erect is because an overflow of blood and storage in that muscular tissue causes it to become firmer or stiffen, which is the result of that blood pressure building up inside of that tissue. The reason for the erection, obviously, is because this whole process helps out with the male's part of sexual reproduction, the insertion of a penis, and ultimately the ejaculation of sperm. All right. The vagina also contributes to the act of sexual intercourse through the secretion of different fluids, which can help with the process of sperm traveling through the vagina, getting into the cervix and the uterus. And then, of course, we have through sexual activity. The final part, I guess, for the male's perspective is ejaculation, which is the release of sperm. Typically, this is about 500 million sperm, give or take, depending on age and your health conditions and your diet. This can vary greatly, but on average, we're looking at millions and millions of sperm being released all at once. And remember, for fertilization to occur, it's only a single sperm that actually gets to do that. It gets to fertilize the egg. So from millions of sperm, it's going to be whittled down to a single sperm. So let's talk about this process of how do we remove all of these sperm from the equation so that just a single sperm actually can get to that egg and fertilize it. So the journey to the egg is actually a very difficult one. There's lots of things that are going to stop sperm, going to kill sperm, going to trap sperm, or even in some cases maybe like mislead sperm so they end up going the wrong direction. And this is all a selective process because really if we're reproducing, we want the best genes to pass on to our offspring so that they have the best chance of themselves being able to survive. And so the eggs, they have been formed inside the ovary, and a lot of care has been given to them by the follicles in order to make them these large, stable cells that are ready for reproduction. Sperm, however, it's more quantity over quality. So millions of sperm are being produced, but a good number of them are actually going to be not great sperm. They're not going to necessarily have the best genetic combination. They're not going to be the best formed cells. And so all of these trials or obstacles that the sperm are going through is basically a natural way to weed out the weaker sperm so that the best ones are more likely to survive and get to the egg. So right off the bat, about half the sperm are going to immediately die because the vaginal secretions that are released are acidic. And the main reason for this is actually to protect the vagina from infection. So you have acidic environments wherever you have some type of orifice in your body. Your earwax, slightly acidic in there, your nose, your mouth, slightly acidic, your skin is slightly acidic, because acidic conditions are more difficult for things to survive, like bacteria. So the vagina as well has a bunch of fluids that are secreted in the vagina to make it as an acidic environment. So if any bacteria get in there, they're really likely to die rather than to cause some type of infection inside that orifice, so that opening of the body. And because of this condition, the first sperm that are actually released almost die immediately, and so they slightly modify the pH of the vaginal secretions by just adding so much sperm and semen fluid to the vaginal secretions. And so eventually, after successful ejaculation, after the pH has been a little bit more neutralized, the sperm that are a little bit more towards the middle of the ejaculation, they actually get to live and continue on to the rest of the journey. So unfortunately, the first wave are going to die very, very quickly because of this acidic conditions. All right. So from that point, there are a lot of other obstacles that get in the way. The cervix, which is that narrow opening between the vagina and the uterus, the sperm have to get through the cervix. And the cervix is never completely open, except, of course, during birth. So it is a relatively thick mucus. It thins a little bit during ovulation, so that it does make it a little bit easier for sperm to travel through it during ovulation. But the mucus itself is difficult to swim through. So sperm that are poor swimmers or not formed appropriately will not be able to get through the cervix very well, so we're removing them from the equation. From there, we also have the inside of the body, really the central part in the uterus. There are lots of white blood cells, because remember, it is a body that needs to protect itself from bacteria, needs to protect itself from viruses and infection. So there are a lot of white blood cells floating around in the tissue fluids inside of the uterus. Now, remember, white blood cells are designed to get rid of anything that doesn't belong in the body, something they don't recognize as a part of that body. And sperm from another person are not part of that original person's DNA. They're not part of the woman's DNA. So the white blood cells will not recognize the sperm as something that belongs there. They would recognize the sperm as invaders. And so they will treat them just like bacteria cells. They will do phagocytosis. They will consume the entire sperm. They will break them down and digest them and kill them. So that is another obstacle that they have to get through. They have to move through these lines of white blood cells that they might bump into randomly and might be killed by these white blood cells. Then, inside the uterus, particularly the fallopian tube, there are lots of ciliated cells. And so these ciliated cells are there to help push the egg from the ovary down the oviduct in order to get to the uterus. And so remember, the egg doesn't have a flagella. It doesn't have a way to move like the sperm do. So the cilia and the movement of the cilia is really what's helping the egg move in the right direction. Unfortunately, though, all these little tendril cilia sticking out from the sides of the inner lining of the uterus and the oviduct do make it difficult for sperm cells, because they can get trapped inside of them and then they're stuck there, eventually, dying out. However, this also can help a little bit with the process of fertilization, because some sperm might get stuck there for a few days, because sperm can live for about 3 to 4 days outside of the body, well, not outside the body, but inside the vaginal canal, inside of the uterus. They can live for a few days there. And so sperm that might get trapped there very early on, they might be released as like a third wave of sperm if they manage to get themselves out of the cilia and then continue on the path to the egg towards the oviduct. Unfortunately, this kind of throws off the timing of fertilization, and it's not necessarily the best eggs or fertilized eggs form in this process. Sometimes the fertilization happens too late, and because of that, the zygote is not ready for implantation. So rather than it implanting into the uterus and it developing into a fetus, menstruation just starts over again, and it's going to be lost with the endometrium during the bleeding period. But sometimes it is successful. So sometimes the cilia can help, but more often not, they're going to make it harder on the sperm. And so And then also at this point, there is a 50-50 chance that the sperm end up just going the wrong direction. So remember, there are two oviducts, there are two ovaries, they're on opposite sides of the body, and only one of them releases an egg at a time, unless there's, sometimes there can be issues where both ovaries release an egg. That's where you get fraternal twins. You get two babies that are of different DNA because they come from two different eggs. But more often, it's only a single egg that gets released from a single ovary. So there's a 50-50 chance that the sperm pick the right oviduct when they're swimming forward. If it's the left one, release the egg, and if they swim towards the right one, well, then they're not going to have enough time to turn around. They don't really have the sense to like turn around. They just kind of go forward until they find the egg. So they pick the wrong direction, and so half of those sperm are going to be out of the picture because they went the wrong way. And then from the 500 million we kind of started with, we're going to whittle it down to about 50 sperm that actually get to the egg. Again, this varies greatly. This is kind of the average. And then those 50 sperm, it's the kind of the race to get through the zona pellucida using the acrosome, so digesting that jelly using the enzymes that they have, and seeing which one of them actually gets through the zona pellucida first to fertilize the egg successfully, forming a zygote. Just to remind you, this is what fertilization looks like. So those last 50 sperm cells, they're going to be using their acrosomes to try to digest that zona pellucida to actually fuse with the egg, right? So that's the whole point of the acrosome, is that the zona pellucida is that last line of filtering out the weak sperm. So only one sperm can fuse with the egg. The zona pellucida, as soon as a sperm fuses with it, as soon as a sperm fuses with the membrane of the egg cell, the zona pellucida hardens, changes into a different material through a really quick chemical reaction that cannot be digested anymore. So any sperm that might be moving their way in, they're now trapped inside of it, and then will just degrade over time. Any sperm that haven't started the process on the outside, they no longer can get through because it just cannot be digested anymore by those enzymes. Okay, and so when this happens, when a sperm and egg cell fuse together, we call that fertilization. And the two haploid cells have to fuse their nucleuses together. So the haploid nucleus, the 23 chromosomes from the sperm and the 23 chromosomes from the egg, those two haploids come together. 23 plus 23 makes 46, which is our regular diploid number. So we have a new diploid cell. So remember this vocabulary, it is important. And we call this diploid cell a zygote. So a newly formed diploid cell is called a zygote. From there, the zygote will go through very, very fast mitosis. The most amount of growth you've ever gone through in your whole life. It's not puberty. It's not when you're just a newborn baby. It is the very first few days of your existence as a group of cells. So you go from a single cell to a ball of cells to in a matter of 6 days. So very, very quickly, you're going through very rapid division. You're going from a single cell to hundreds of thousands to a million cells within a few days. So very, very rapid mitosis, the fastest you'll ever go through. Eventually, though, this creates a ball of cells, and then eventually an embryo, which is a group of cells that have different types of roles. We have outer cells, we have inner cells. The outer cells will make the amniotic sac, which will protect the developing inner cells, which turn into the fetus. And then there will be a special group of cells that will turn into the placenta as well whenever it implants on the uterus. So now let's look a little bit at development, about what happens during the leading up to implantation. So that rapid growth that happens after fertilization, the reason why it is so rapid is because there's only a few days for the egg to travel down the oviduct, right? So it's a relatively slow path. It's not going to be zipping down the oviduct into the uterus. It's going to take a few days to do that. And that's actually designed that way because fertilization happening in the oviduct, if its fertilization is happening, around here in our oviduct, we have all of this path, right? We have all of this time to become a ball of cells. We need to develop into a blastocyst, which is a ball of cells, because a blastocyst has the ability to do this, has the ability to implant on the side of the uterus, therefore allowing the development of the placenta, allowing the development of the cells to become a fetus, and obviously, for pregnancy to occur. If implantation does not occur, then we do not get the progesterone and estrogen levels to be maintained, and there will be a restarting of the menstrual cycle. And so the fertilized egg, the blastocyst at this point, will be lost. It will be miscarried before the person even knows that they are pregnant when they go through their monthly bleeding period. Again, as I'd said, most women will have miscarriages in their life, and a good number of them will happen when they don't even know that they're pregnant because something like this. Because fertilization happened at the wrong time in the process, or there was maybe a bad combination of genes between the sperm and the egg, and so it didn't necessarily go through the right type of mitosis or enough mitosis, or something else happened. And so they became technically pregnant. They had a fertilized egg developing into a blastocyst, developing into a possible fetus inside of their uterus, but because it didn't implant, it was lost when they just had their period again, and they had no idea that this had happened to them. And so we need to get to a blastocyst, which is a ball of cells, during this time going down the fallopian tube, down the oviduct, in order to get to the implantation phase in the endometrium. And so implantation, if you haven't picked up on this by now, means to physically implant into the line of the uterus. And this is necessary because it keeps the corpus luteum stable, which you remember is what's maintaining our progesterone and estrogen levels. And so if those progesterone levels drop, that's when we have menstruation again. That's when we have the bleeding period. So we need implantation to happen so that we don't lose the fertilized egg, and so it can stay inside the body and, develop more into an eventual fetus and to a baby. Okay, the area of implantation is also very important because that's where the placenta is going to form. The placenta is a very, very thin layer connecting the baby's circulatory system and the mother's circulatory system. And so obviously the mother is going to be eating food and drinking water and taking vitamins and things for two, is what we say, because they need it for themselves and they need it for the developing baby. And that is very accurate because the baby is only going to be getting nutrition, it's going to be getting water, it's going to have waste removal, all done through the mother's blood. However, we need to protect the developing fetus from infection. When you're a developing fetus, you do not really have an immune system, right? You develop an immune system much, much later on in the development process, and your real immune system doesn't really start to happen until after you're born. So you're very weak, you're very susceptible to disease. So to limit the contact with potential diseases, the blood of the mother and the blood of the fetus never mix. They just get very, very close to each other, just like, the blood around your small intestine or the blood around your lungs, right? We have a very, very small or thin layer so that we have very rapid diffusion. And so extra nutrients and extra oxygen that is in the mother's blood, when it passes through this area near the placenta, it will diffuse. It will move from, by concentration gradient, from one area, the mother's blood, through this layer of tissues called the placenta, leading into the child's, developing fetus's blood system. And then from there, it goes through the umbilical cord, which connects the fetus to the placenta. And then from there, it goes into the actual baby's body and the actual baby's circulatory system. This is also how waste material gets removed, right? Obviously, doing all this cellular respiration, CO2 levels are very high in the blood of the fetus. Also urea, right? They don't have a urinary system yet, so their urea has to be removed in some way. So the blood moving through the placenta will also add this material to the mother. And so the mother will have to be responsible for getting rid of the CO2 through her lungs or getting through the urea through her own urinary system, through her own kidneys. And so really that's the main role of the placenta, is to allow for this connection between the mother, for this exchange of nutrients and waste material, but it's also designed to protect the baby from potential diseases. All right, so oxygen, nutrients are transferred in, CO2 and waste material transferred out. Now, when we formed that blastocyst, we had a ball of cells. We had an inner ball of cells, and we had an outer layer ball of cells. Right? That outer layer became parts of the placenta, and it became parts of what we call the amniotic sac and amniotic fluid. And so you can see this in this diagram. There's this kind of like tissue layer surrounding the baby, and then there's kind of a gray empty space on the inside. So that tissue layer that the baby's kind of surrounded by, that is the amniotic sac. And so it's basically there to hold the amniotic fluid. And so we are developed in a watery environment, right? The uterus is mostly just open space. There's not a bunch of there's fluid along the inside of the walls there, but it's not like full of fluid. So in order to develop in a watery environment, we need the amniotic sac to hold all of the liquid that we call the amniotic fluid. And the main purpose of the amniotic fluid and that sac working together is to maintain a protective environment. If the mother happens to bump her stomach during pregnancy, or she fell down or something like that, the shock wave of that potential damage would be reduced, because the vibrations would have to move through the liquid before they would get to the actual fetus, to the actual baby. And so it decreases the impact of any type of damage that might happen to the baby, and it also maintains very specific temperatures. The mother's body temperature might fluctuate greatly depending on different times of the year, different times of the day, what you might be wearing or what you might be doing, but we need the baby's temperature, the area around the baby, to be as consistent as possible in order to have the best possible growth, to have the fastest growth, so the baby is healthy as possible before it's actually born. So the amniotic fluid maintains a consistent body temperature. It prevents the area around the baby from fluctuating very much, regardless of what's happening to the mother. All right, so all of these things are designed in order to have a healthy baby develop over a healthy fetus, develop into an eventual baby, and then of course after about 40 weeks, this whole process actually takes 10 months, not 9 months. Normally it takes about a month for someone to even realize that they are pregnant. So really it's about 10 months if we go from fertilization to actual birth. Then the amniotic fluid will be released. That's when we say a woman's water has broken. Literally the water will come out of the vagina because the amniotic fluid has broken, the sac has broken, and the fluid just runs down out of the reproductive system. Then they will start going into labor, which will cause the cervix to dilate. It will get very large enough for the baby's head and the rest of its body to fit through the cervix. The vagina will also stretch a little bit as well, and then we'll go through the birthing process of pushing the baby through muscular contractions in the uterus out of the woman through the cervix, passing through the vagina, or also known as our birth canal. So before we move on, I just wanted one more time to show you this kind of diagram to kind of show you how quickly you have to go through development after this successful fertilization. Successful fertilization, again, happening here in the fallopian tube. Over the course of a few days, you're going to go from a single cell to a blastocyst, which is hundreds of thousands to like about 1 million cells. And so in order to do such rapid development, the mitosis is at an extreme rate. You're going through very, very quick mitosis in order to make so many cells so that you can go through the process of implantation and successfully develop into a fetus so that you can be born. Now, based on everything I just showed you, it seems like it's actually kind of difficult to get pregnant. And I don't want you guys testing this theory, but it is actually not the easiest thing to get pregnant. It's about a 1 in 10,000 chance that a single sexual act will result in a healthy baby being born, right? There are a lot of things that can get in the way. There could be problems with the sperm traveling to the egg. There could be problems with the thickness of the cervix. There could be problems with the releasing of the egg. There could be problems with the timing of the fertilization. There could be problems with the rapid mitosis leading up to implantation. There could be problems with implantation. Sometimes an egg, or a fertilized egg, even though it developed into a blastocyst, it can't implant. Sometimes there's problems with the egg, or there's problems with the endometrium that they just can't implant. Sometimes you can become pregnant, and you can be pregnant for multiple months before a miscarriage happens. There could be some type of genetic issue or structural issue that just appears during the development of the fetus, and the fetus doesn't survive, and unfortunately it will be miscarried. Again, this happens. It's happens more often than people talk about, so just be aware of this. So, given that, there are some individuals who are actually infertile. And so fertility is the ability to actually reproduce a human being, to go through the process of reproduction successfully. And infertility is defined as people who are incapable of getting pregnant after 12 months of trying. So they're kind of tracking their cycles, They're trying to determine when ovulation is actually happening. They're having sex, at the optimum time for pregnancy to occur. They might even be taking special hormone medication to help, make sure ovulation is happening and help me even increase sperm count. And it's still not working, right? And so people who are infertile might not actually be capable of having a child on their own without some additional procedures because of various things that could be causing it. So let's look at the causes for infertility. We want to look at both the men and the women because they're both contributing half of the genetic material. Think about what are some of the things that might happen that could go wrong in the male's part of the reproduction act or in the female's part of the reproductive act that would prevent fertilization from being able to occur. So, looking at women, one of the most common, or one of the first things that they will check, because it's the biggest issue, would be that the ovaries are not releasing the ovum, they're not releasing the egg, or ovulation is not happening. This could be because there's problems with the buildup of estrogen and FSH and LH, right? It's particularly LH as well. So if someone's not ovulating, then they might need to be doing hormone treatments in order to help ovulation occur. There could be blockage in the oviduct, so the egg could be released, but the oviducts are too small, or there might be tissue folds that are kind of getting in the way, and so the egg cannot travel through the oviduct in order to get to the uterus, and that also might mean that the sperm cannot get through the oviduct to get to the egg. So that could be a problem. It might require a surgery or maybe in vitro fertilization, which we'll talk about in just a minute as a method to deal with infertility. There could be problem with the endometrium, right? Maybe the endometrium isn't developing enough, so there isn't very good implantation of the fertilized egg, or possibly there are hormone problems, and the endometrium keeps getting lost even though implantation does happen. And then there could be, again, hormonal problems just in general. Maybe the egg doesn't develop properly because of issues with FSH or estrogen early on in the menstrual cycle. And so because of those hormone problems, the egg isn't developed properly, and so that's why the person might be infertile. From the man's side, there could be low sperm counts, right? Remember we said about 500 million sperm, and we're going to whittle that down to about 50. If you are only producing like 50,000 sperm or 100,000 sperm, there's a very limited chance that those sperm will make it to the egg for fertilization because so few of them are there at the beginning. So low sperm count might mean we have to do something like infertilization or in vitro fertilization. There could be poor quality of the sperm. So if they're not developed properly, possibly they're not going to be able to swim the distance or make it through all the obstacles to get to the egg. So even though there might be enough of them, they might just be very poor quality sperm. There could be blockage or damage to the sperm ducts. So even though it might seem like ejaculation is occurring, so the seminal vesicle and the prostate are releasing the fluid that we think of whenever we think of like semen and sperm, there might not be actual sperm inside the fluid because they didn't actually get from the testes to the seminal vesicles and the prostate gland because of some type of blockage. This might require a surgery as well in order to fix this problem. And then, of course, there could be hormonal problems in the male. There could be problems with the development of the sperm in general because of testosterone levels. And so that could be a reason for poor quality sperm or for the low sperm count existing. So we might need to use hormonal treatments to help the male along. To summarize these ideas, looking at men versus women, we can have abnormal sperm. Here, looking at some of the sperm being deformed and having too large of a sperm head so they can't swim very well, multiple tails, multiple heads, something wrong with the formation of the midsection, something wrong with the formation of the sperm tail. These all could affect the ability of the sperm to swim. And then, of course, absence of sperm, either because of blockage of a sperm duct or very low sperm counts, right? Then we have ovary disorders, so hormones not allowing ovulation to occur or proper formation of the egg. So there's something wrong with the hormone levels. There could be blockage inside of the oviduct. Some of the tissue might be getting in the way, preventing the sperm and egg from meeting. We could have endometriotitis. This is where the endometrium layer inside the uterus has spread to other parts of the oviduct. So as the endometrium gets thicker, the oviducts actually get smaller because of the thickening of this layer. And so it actually starts to block or prevent the eggs from traveling through the oviduct, specifically because of the endometrium. Tissue has moved to or spread to other parts of the body, isn't just located just on the inner lining of the uterus, it's also located in the oviducts as well. That also becomes a hormonal problem. And then, of course, we have anti-sperm antibodies, right? The immune system of the female might be particularly strong, and so being so aggressive, it might just be, destroying so many sperm that it really lowers the number quickly, and so we're not getting enough sperm to the egg, and that's causing the infertility issues. So, if somebody is infertile, we might have to be using fertility drugs in order to help them out. So fertility drugs are used to either help men or women, depending on where the issue might be, in order to help them produce eggs every month or to release more sperm, develop more sperm through testosterone. Specifically with women, the way it works is that we're trying to get the body to produce more eggs or going through ovulation more often, so that increases the chance that there actually is successful fertility. Or if we're going to do something like IVF, where we need to collect the eggs and then fertilize the eggs outside the body, which we'll talk about in just a minute, we need to collect lots of eggs all at the same time. So we use hormonal treatment to get the ovaries to kind of super ovulate, and that is the actual term. I'm not making that up. It's super ovulation, where multiple ovulations are occurring within a very, very short window so that we can collect multiple eggs or increase the chance of fertilization happening. And of course, if we're going to be using hormones in order to trigger superovulation, what would be the hormone that we would have to be using in this mixture? We would need lots of, you remember, LH, right? Because LH is the hormone whose main function is to trigger ovulation. Now, if fertilization inside the body is really not an option, we can superovulate the woman and we can collect eggs from the woman, and we can collect sperm from the man, and we can go through a process called IVF. And IVF stands for in vitro fertilization. So in vivo, that is Latin for in living, or part of the living, so inside a living person. So in vivo fertilization, that's regular fertilization. That's intercourse where fertilization happens in the oviduct. In vitro stands for glass, or means glass. So it means fertilization on a glass container, specifically a petri dish. So what will happen is that we will superovulate superovulate the woman and collect a bunch of eggs, and then we will place those eggs on a petri dish with a bunch of sperm that has been collected from the male. And so sometimes people call these test tube babies, by the way, but we don't actually use test tubes because it would make all this process very difficult. We use petri dishes. And so we allow the eggs and sperm to meet on the petri dish and go through fertilization. They actually go through fertilization and then a few stages of mitosis. We normally allow them to become a ball of cells before we then implant them back into the uterus. And so we'll use a device to take 2 to 3 of these fertilized eggs, of these now balls of cells, and we will physically put them into the uterus through a small little procedure, and then we will hopefully, if this is successful, get the fertilized eggs, get these blastocysts to actually implant onto the uterus, and then the woman now successfully becomes pregnant. So let's map out those steps just to make sure you understand the process. So first, we have to collect sperm and eggs from both the male and female who want to be having this baby. Then we're going to have about 1 egg mixed with about 100,000 sperm directly on the petri dish. Very high probability that fertilization is successful given these odds. Then we will take those fertilized eggs, those embryos now. Normally we take 2. Some people might try for 3. We normally don't do just 1 though, because the more fertilized eggs that we use, that we put inside of the uterus, we transplant into the uterus, the better the chance that this is successful, right? We do need the implantation to occur. We can't implant it ourselves. We have to put it into the uterus and then help it goes through the implantation process by itself. So if you use 2 of them, you double the chance that this could happen. And, worst case scenario, instead of having 1 baby, you have 2 babies, right? Because both of them implant. If you have just a single fertilized egg, then you're putting all of this pressure onto this 1 egg, hoping that it's successful. And of course, obviously, this procedure is fairly expensive. to do all these procedures and to do the hormones that are necessary to go through this process. So if you're going to pay a lot of money for this process, maybe you want to increase your probability as much as possible. You could use 3, and normally we cap it off at 3, but the problem with that is that if all 3 embryos implant and are successful, typically triplets, or having 3 babies at one time, is kind of the maximum the human body can deal with and safely grow or raise those children. You dramatically increase the chance that something happens in the process of developing the fetuses that leads to a miscarriage, or that the children are born but they're much weaker and much smaller than they should be because they didn't get to develop as properly in the uterus, because there's just limited space inside the uterus. There's only how much space that the human body can stretch. So we normally cap it at 2. Some places will do it at 3. Now, and again, so why do we use 2? Because we're increasing the chance that this is successful. Now, we don't use 10, right? We don't want to use a crazy amount to increase those odds, because again, there's not enough space for the fetuses, and the more we put in, the greater the chance that will be lost. However, sometimes miracles happen. So there was a famous woman who really wanted to get pregnant, and she was having issues, and so she went to a country, I'm not going to say where, that didn't have such strict rules, and they used 8 embryos because she wanted to maximize the chance that it happened. And luck would have it, all 8 embryos implanted, and she successfully gave birth to 8 babies all at once. So she had octuplets, which is the first time this has ever happened. People were calling her Octomom, right? And so her children all survived. They're all born relatively healthy, though of course they were much smaller than they should be. Even today, if you look this up and you want to see what her kids look like now, they are thinner and they are shorter than they should be at their age, because they did not have the space to properly develop during the process. Now, what she did is amazing, but it is incredibly unethical, because it is very, very dangerous to have done something like this. She had a very high probability that one baby could have died, and then if one baby died, there was a chance that all the babies could have died, so she put all these babies' lives at risk, and then she put her own life at risk. Having 8 babies inside of you, the human body can only take so much. It could have killed her during the process of birth, and then all those babies wouldn't have a mother to take care of them, or if one of the babies had died later on in the process of development, that could have killed her as well, because having a dead thing inside of you isn't particularly good for your body. So this very, very amazing but highly unethical thing that has happened. So now that we talked about how pregnancy actually happens, how fertilization and development of the child happens, we've talked about what happens when people just can't seem to get pregnant and what options they have for themselves. So now we're going to spend the rest of the time talking about what is it you do, what should you be doing if you want to have sex, but you do not want to have a child. So how do you prevent yourself from getting pregnant, and also how do you stop yourself from spreading diseases? All right, so I'm not going to teach you about different different sexually transmitted diseases, but all sexually transmitted diseases are pretty horrible. Even the ones that are treatable, and most of them are not treatable, most of them, you're kind of stuck with them for the rest of your life if you have them. They're going to make you uncomfortable. They're going to make your genitalia uncomfortable. They can make sex uncomfortable. And worst case scenario, things like HIV, they can kill you. They can shorten your lifespan. So as we go through these notes, we're going to talk about not only how do we prevent pregnancy by these methods, but whether or not they actually prevent the spreading of disease. And I hope that you, when it comes time for you to do some type of sexual act, will remember that you shouldn't just be worrying about pregnancy. You should actually be worrying even more about disease, because in some ways, you're more likely to get a sexually transmitted disease than you are to accidentally become pregnant. So please make sure that you're selecting birth control methods that do prevent you from getting sexually transmitted diseases. Okay, so To prevent pregnancy or birth control, the scientific word is contraception. So it's a device, or it's a method, or it's a treatment, or it's a medicine that is used to prevent or limit the chance of pregnancy from occurring, particularly from fertilization from occurring. It's mostly we're trying to stop fertilization from happening. And so there are major categories of contraceptions, depending on how complex they need to be done, how much money and how much forethought that goes into it, and their availability. So we're going to talk about these different types. We're going to talk about examples in each type, and you need to know these. You need to know the four different types, and you need to know examples of those types and how they work. So we have mechanical methods. So that means just physically stopping the sperm and the eggs from meeting each other inside of the oviducts. And so these are probably the ones you're most familiar with, things like condoms and femidons and diaphragms. Then we have chemical methods, and so these are things that either kill the sperm or in some level will prevent ovulation. They'll prevent the egg from getting released. If there's no egg, then the sperm can't fertilize it. Then we'll look at the natural method, which is the worst thing to ever try. And I should teach you about it because it does exist, but I'm going to say this numerous times. Do not do this. It is the highest probability that you both get an STD and you get pregnant. It is a horrible idea, but it is something that some people use depending on certain choices they might need to make in their life. But the natural method is basically trying to track your period so that you don't have sex on the days you're most likely to get pregnant, or the days before and after ovulation when you're most likely to fertilize an egg and then become pregnant. Okay? And obviously, limiting ejaculation of the sperm in the vagina, or the idea of removing the penis just before ejaculation so that sperm are not ejaculated into the vagina, but they are ejaculated outside of the body. This is also a really bad idea, men. First off, ejaculation can be very difficult to time or control or plan for, and then there's also something called pre-cum or pre-semen, which is released prior to ejaculation that you don't actually know about. It's actually very difficult to feel that this has happened. And in that fluid that is released, there can be sperm. There's very few sperm, but there can be sperm. So this is a very bad idea as well if you're actually trying to stop someone from getting pregnant. And then there is the surgical method, and these are the more extreme versions of permanently stopping someone from releasing sperm or releasing eggs because they do not plan to have children anymore. So this is normally a method that is used later in people's lives after they have children. They just no longer want to worry about having them. And this would be our surgical methods. All right, so we're going to go through each one of these, and we will talk about the examples in these categories and how well they protect against pregnancy and how well they protect against disease. So starting with the mechanical method, we have 3 different commonly available devices that can help prevent the sperm from getting into the uterus and ultimately up to the oviducts and fertilizing the egg. So the most common, the most readily available, and probably the easiest to use in some cases would be the condom, which is normally a thin rubber tubing. It's normally latex rubber that covers the penis and therefore catches the semen during ejaculation. The end of the condom has a reservoir, has an extra layer of rubber that is supposed to be hanging off the front of the penis, and it is there to catch the sperm, right? So the volume of sperm that's produced by the average male should be able to fill up this extra section at the end of the tip of the condom without overflowing it, causing it to break. That is one of the problems, though, when it comes to the negatives of condoms, is that there are times where condoms can break if they are not being used properly or stored properly. So the pros of this is that they are very cheap. They are really easy to use if you know what you're doing. They're about 90% effective at stopping pregnancy and disease. Obviously, it's really good at stopping disease because the main reason why disease passes from one person to another through sexual intercourse is the exchange of bodily fluids. Semen can carry those diseases that we're like different bacteria and viruses that cause sexually transmitted diseases. Vaginal secretions also carry those diseases. So if the semen do not mix with the vagina, or the vaginal juices do not really mix with the penis directly, you won't transmit the disease between individuals. So that's why the condom and the other ones we'll be talking about are really effective at stopping disease. And in fact, the first two that we're talking about are the only ones that are effective at stopping disease and also stopping pregnancy. Everything else that we'll be getting into only stop pregnancy. They don't stop disease. So you really should be using these first two methods when you're having sex with different people that you don't really know their sexual history. You don't know if they have a disease or not. They haven't been tested for sexual transmitted diseases, so you should be safe and be using these specific two methods, the condom and the femidom, which I'll show you in a second. And also, just as a good practice, if you become sexually active, if you are having sex regularly with people, you should be getting yourself regularly tested for sexually transmitted diseases. Not all sexually transmitted diseases, particularly HIV, for example, show symptoms. So you could be having it and you could be passing it around to people, spreading the disease, and you wouldn't know until much later when those symptoms appear. So you should be tested regularly, about every 3 to 6 months, depending on how active you are. You should be having a simple STD test. You go to the doctor, you go to Planned Parenthood, like a facility, and they will do the blood test very easily. They can test for various sexually transmitted diseases, and then they can get you the results within a few days. Okay, the cons, the bad parts of using condoms, they can break during sex, particularly if there isn't enough lubrication, if it's particularly dry. Friction and heat can wear down the rubber, causing them to break. Sometimes condoms can break and the male and female are not aware of it. So ejaculation will occur, but rather than the condom stopping the sperm from escaping, the sperm will just go directly into the vagina, which could lead into pregnancy. And obviously, if a person doesn't use them properly, it causes a lot of problems. Men, you should be using condoms that fit the penis, right? It should be pretty tight around the penis. It should not be something that easily falls off. If you are using a condom that falls off during sex, you are using condoms too big for your penis. You should be using smaller condoms. It's much better to be using condoms that are appropriate to you rather than using massive condoms that actually don't work and can increase the probability of getting diseases or getting someone pregnant. So make sure you're using a condom that is appropriate for the size of your penis. Now, an alternative method to this would be something called a femidom. So femidoms are a little bit harder to find. Normally they're not located in most stores. It might be something you have to buy online, but it's kind of like a larger condom that is designed to fit the inside of the vagina. So in this instances, the man doesn't really need to be wearing a condom because the female has a condom-like device inside the inner lining of the vagina. And so there it will, once it's inserted, it's used during sex, and then it can catch the semen that is released by the male, and then you remove the femidom and throw it away, just like you would throw away a condom after it has been used. Again, they're very cheap. They're just as effective as condoms as long as they are used properly, and again, they can stop both pregnancy and disease because the male juices and the female juices, bodily juices, are not mixing with each other, so there won't be an exchange of bacteria or viruses. Obviously, the negative is that they can break. They are not as simple to use. Inserting them can be kind of difficult. A woman might have to practice how to do this if she's trying to do it effectively, and it can be uncomfortable depending on the size of the femidom, the size of the woman's vagina. It might not be the most enjoyable sensation, so they're less popular than something like condoms. And then we get into the diaphragm. And so the diaphragm is a relatively old version of preventing in pregnancy. Modern people aren't really using them as much. It's an older generation from the 70s and 80s. This was more of a common idea. So the diaphragm is kind of like a rubber cap that is designed to kind of fit over the area where the cervix is, extending down into the vagina. And so it's basically just a covering of the cervix so that the sperm won't get through the cervix and therefore possibly impregnate the woman. The benefits to this is that it is the only one on this list that is reusable, so you actually don't just throw them away. You clean it there's different chemical cleaning process that you should go through, but you can clean it and reuse it, which can make it effective and a little bit easier with keeping it or maintaining it. It's only about 85 effective against stopping pregnancy because it's not super easy to put in, right? It can be difficult to use. It is something that has to be practiced to know that it's in the right position. If you insert it and it slips into the wrong position during sex, then you might think that it's protecting you from the sperm from getting to the cervix, but actually the cervix is exposed, and so the sperm are getting in through the cervix and could impregnate the person. And then, of course, it doesn't stop the mixing of fluids in the vagina and with the semen mixing with the vaginal fluids and the penis mixing with vaginal fluids, so it doesn't stop the spread of disease. All right, so it's really not the best option, but it is one that exists as a mechanical method. Oh, sorry, yeah. Now, another newer, like more modern mechanical method is something called an IUD, or an intrauterine device, and it's that little thing there in the picture. It's a little T-shaped plastic material covered with copper wiring, and then that copper wiring is covered with progesterone hormone. And so what they do, or what a woman does, is that she inserts this material, or it is inserted, sorry. They don't insert it, a doctor inserts it for you, sorry. Or a woman can insert it in herself, but she might need a doctor to insert it for her. It's something you kind of need to be trained to use. And so you insert it all the way through the cervix, and so what it does is it fits in that shape inside the uterus, and the copper lining covered with the progesterone causes the endometrium to become very, very thick, right? Because of the really high progesterone levels. And so the high progesterone levels can make the endometrium very, very thick and help and kind of stop the uterus from any fertilized egg from really being able to successfully implant. So when the egg implants into the endometrium, it needs to be the right size. If it's too thin, the implantation won't be very strong. But if it's too thick, if the endometrium is too thick, it won't be able for the egg to really connect to the mother's circulatory system and form the placenta. So the implantation might happen, but it isn't going to be very successful, and so then the period will occur. So you can use this device to kind of limit the probability of implantation by having an over-thickened endometrium from the exposure of the progesterone that's located on the device. Okay. And at some point, it is possible if the endometrium is thick enough that it can seal the cervix as well, which could therefore stop the sperm from even getting through because of the narrow opening of the cervix becomes even smaller or can become shut because of how thick the endometrium gets. So the pros for this is that it's reusable. You just take it out, wash it. The progesterone doesn't really go anywhere, and you can soak it in a progesterone material to kind of recharge the copper lining if it starts to wear down. And so therefore it's 99% effective against pregnancy, being that both the sperm can actually be stopped from getting through the cervix, or even if implantation happens, it's really unlikely that the implantation will be successful. It's really, really good at stopping pregnancy from occurring. That's why they are popular. However, the negatives is that it is extremely difficult to use. You do have to kind of be trained how to put it in and out, or take it in and out by a doctor. It can be very, very uncomfortable if it's inserted incorrectly. And actually, because it's going through the cervix and being inserted into the uterus, if used improperly, it can cause permanent damage to those areas and actually could lead to someone being infertile in the worst case scenario because the inner lining, the endometrium layer of the uterus, becomes so damaged from its use that the implantation just becomes impossible in the future. And also, being a copper metal, some people can have allergic reactions to them, which causes a whole bunch of other problems. So they do a copper metal allergy test before they allow you to use this because they don't want the copper metal to have a negative reaction with your uterus. You don't want an allergic reaction inside of your uterus. And then, of course, it doesn't help the spread of disease. It doesn't stop the spread of disease. You still have the male's fluid and the female's fluid mixing in the vagina, so you can still have disease spreading through sexual intercourse. Okay, so let's get into the chemical methods now. So the most basic chemical method is something called spermicide. It is a specific chemical that can be injected into the vagina after sex. It should be done immediately after sex, though. It has to be done very quickly after sex finishes. And it kills sperm specifically. It doesn't really damage the vagina. It's not super abrasive to vaginal walls, but it is very effective at getting rid of sperm, at killing sperm, being that they're susceptible to low pH. It's very cheap. It's very easy to use, right? You just have kind of a syringe full of the fluid, and you just very carefully insert it and then add the spermicide from the syringe into the vagina. It's only about 75% effective against pregnancy, though. It's not super great on its own. However, it's really, really good when used with a condom. So now there are kind of modern condoms that have spermicide material that's added to the outside of the condom. So in case the condom actually breaks, the spermicide chemical that's on the outside of the condom might help kill the sperm if the condom breaks during sex. Or if you use a condom and then after sex, just in case the condom had a hole in it, or it broke or something like that, or something it wasn't used properly, or if you used a femidom and it maybe didn't happen properly, if you use the spermicide after sex, regardless of what method you were using, you help reduce pregnancy a lot. So it's not necessarily great by itself, but it's really good when used with other materials. And then, of course, it doesn't protect against disease because the sperm and sexual fluid has already been added to the vagina, so there could have been a mixing of bacteria and viruses during that process, so disease can still happen. And then, of course, there are some people who might have allergic reactions to it just because of the chemicals that are inside of it. So it might be something that you can't use based on whether or not your vagina has a reaction to it. Okay, but again, it's best used with other methods. And then maybe the more famous chemical form would be the pill, or birth control pill. And so what it is, it's a daily dose of progesterone that will then prevent FSH and LH from causing ovulation. And so here, looking at the device, basically it's a series of pills for an entire month, right? You have the yellow ones, which are progesterone. They have progesterone in them. And so you take them every single day. You should probably take them around the same time as well in order to keep your progesterone levels regular. And so by taking the progesterone pills every single day, your progesterone levels stay very, very high in your body. And so remember, progesterone prevents LH and FSH from really building up inside of your body. And if you don't have FSH and LH spiking, you cannot have ovulation. You will not release an egg. So by taking this pill every single day, you never release your egg through ovulation. However, you still need to have a regular period. You cannot just have your endometrium getting super thick and staying that way. And you do want to get rid of that inner lining at some point. So in order to do that, we have the white pills. And so every 4th week, there is a series of white pills that are just sugar pills. They don't have any progesterone inside of them. And when you take them, because there's no progesterone in them, your progesterone levels drop, and then you have your period. You have your menstruation happen, and so the endometrium is lost over the course of those 7 days, and then you start up again on your next set of pills, raising your progesterone levels again, and then that prevents ovulation from ever happening. Now, pros of this is that, one, it is very easy to use. All you need to do is take this pill, or the woman has to take this pill every single day, normally around the same time. So if you get into the habit like, oh, I take it after I brush my teeth, or I take it, right before I have my breakfast, wherever you work it into your daily routine, it's perfectly fine, all right? You take the pill, and then you're done. And then the next day you just need to do it again. And because of this, because the egg is not released, unless there is a mess up, it is almost 100% effective. Normally that 2% that's missing is people making mistakes when they use it. It is really, really effective against pregnancy, right? And again, the pill can be taken at any time in the day. It just needs to be taken every single day consistently. So that can be part of the con, right? It is expensive. It doesn't prevent against sexually transmitted diseases. It only stops ovulation from happening. But also the con is that you have to take it every single day. If you miss a day, if you forget, your progesterone levels can drop within that day and you can't ovulate. And then you're having sex thinking that there's no way you can get pregnant because you didn't release an egg, but you actually did because you missed one day. So you do have to take it every single day to guarantee that you do not go through ovulation. All right, so the pill, relatively cheap. Normally, healthcare plans cover people from being able to cover them, so they're able to get the pill very effectively, very cheaply. It's not a super expensive thing to make, so it doesn't cost a lot to get your pregnancy pills, your birth control pills. Now, for the natural method, or also known as the rhythm method, again, do not do this. I should tell you about it, you should know that it exists, but please do not do this if you can avoid it. It is a horrible idea. So the natural method, or the rhythm method, is using what we call period logs. So basically a woman could write it down, but now there's actually various apps that can help keep track of it for you on your phone. Try to track your period, tracking your menstrual cycle, trying to get an idea of like what's the regular amount. Normally it's about 28 days, but it can vary greatly from woman to woman and from month to month. But you're basically trying to safely predict when you can have sex, because the days before and certain days after ovulation, you shouldn't have sex. Too many days before, you shouldn't be having sex because the sperm can live for 3 to 4 days inside of the woman's body. So there is a chance that fertilization could occur if you have sex too close to ovulation. And you should not be having sex too close after ovulation, because obviously that's when we would expect fertilization to happen, is for the sperm to meet the egg at some point in the fallopian tubes, in the oviducts. So you need to wait a certain amount of time after ovulation before you can safely have sex. So really it's the days right at the very beginning, the very early periods of the menstrual cycle, so right after the bleeding period is ended for a few days, and then really, really close towards the end of the menstrual cycle, when the period is almost going to happen. Those are the times when it's relatively safe to have sex. Now again, that's relatively safe. There are lots of things that can happen that could lead to pregnancy happening, or fertilization and pregnancy occurring, even though it seemed like it would have been a safe time to do this. So the pros is that there are no pros. Really, the only pro is that it doesn't require anything. It doesn't require you to buy medicine. It doesn't require you to go spend money on condoms or other types of contraceptive devices. And then, of course, it doesn't really clash with certain religious beliefs. Most of the people who do use this method, they do it for religious purposes. They are, based on their religion, they are against the idea of using a contraceptive. So using something that would actually stop them from actually becoming pregnant isn't allowed. But they're, trying not to get pregnant because maybe they don't want to have a kid or have so many kids. So at least they're timing their intercourse so that they are less of a chance of actually having a child. The cons of this is that it is extremely unreliable. All right, I cannot stress this. Most of the time, when people have unplanned pregnancies, it's because they are doing this method. All right, there are lots of things that can cause the menstrual cycle to shift: illness, your stress levels, your diet. And so you think that you're doing this properly, and then surprise, you now have become pregnant. So really, it is a horrible idea because it is extremely unreliable. It's only about 70% effective. At best, it's 70% effective, right? And you might be thinking, oh, 70%, that's a pretty big number, right? But remember, 50% is flipping a coin, and you do not want to be doing something where you could be becoming pregnant and change your entire life based on a coin flip. So the idea that it's slightly better than a coin flip is a really bad idea. You do not want to have something that's less than 70% effective. That's just, it really, you're rolling the dice, and you have a pretty good chance that you can get pregnant over time. Okay, so it's not very effective against protecting against pregnancy, and obviously it's not very good at protecting against disease because there's no separation of sexual fluids. So don't do this. It's a horrible idea. All right, moving on. And so the last method we're going to talk about is the surgical methods. There's differences between this depending on if you're a male or a female. Starting with the males, we have the vasectomy. So a vasectomy is where we do a small surgery through the scrotum, and we basically cut and tie off the sperm ducts. And so the person will still, quote unquote, ejaculate. They will still release what looks like semen, because the prostate gland and the seminal vesicles will still operate, but there will be no there'll be no sperm inside of the semen, because the sperm are incapable of getting out of the testes because the sperm duct is blocked, is cut off. All right. So this is 99.9% effective. It's almost impossible for someone to become pregnant if someone has had a vasectomy, because literally the sperm cannot leave the testes to get out of the male's body. All right. Obviously, cons is that male may never be able to have surgery, may have children again. This is normally a permanent option. Technically, you can reverse the surgery in men. You cannot reverse it in females, but you can reverse it in men. But it's not guaranteed. So it's not necessarily something that's easy to reverse. So it is possible that once this has happened, there's no way to go back. Obviously, it's not effective against disease because sexual fluids like the semen, even though there's no sperm in the semen, there is still a release of semen. So you could be carrying disease through that semen. And then obviously it's expensive and it's risky, and there could be problems with doing a surgery. In women, there's different terms for this. We're going to generalize it as sterilization. Sterilization is this idea that we're going to do the same idea as we did in the men. We're going to do it in the women. We're going to cut the oviducts, and we're going to seal them so that the egg, even though it gets released into the oviducts, it cannot get to the uterus. And then also that means that the sperm cannot get to the egg because the oviducts have been sealed through this surgery. All right. Again, 99.9% effective. Unless somehow the surgery isn't done properly, there really isn't any reason someone should get pregnant once this is done. Negatives, obviously, it's permanent. You cannot undo this surgery. It's too difficult of a surgery to reverse. It's not effective against disease, and again, it's expensive and it's a risk. Doing any type of surgery is a risk to your general health. Okay, so these are all the different methods of contraceptions, and you should know them, and you should be able to explain the different types and the pros and cons, both when referring to diseases and referring to percent of pregnancies being prevented. Now, before we finish up, I want to introduce one other quote-unquote contraceptive. It's not really a contraceptive traditionally, because it doesn't actually stop fertilization from happening. It is a contraceptive to stop implantation from happening, and if implantation were to occur. And so this is called the morning after pill, or the Plan B. So you may have heard of this before. And so this is basically designed as a pill to help prevent pregnancy from being maintained if other contraceptives fail. So let's say you're having sex and the condom broke. You don't know if that person is going to become pregnant. And rather than wait to decide and to find out if they do become pregnant, which can take a few weeks before you're able to know that you're pregnant, your best bet is to immediately go out to the pharmacy, or the next day go out to the pharmacy, but within a day go to the pharmacy and get this pill. And so what happens when a woman consumes this pill is that within up to 72 hours, but don't push it really, it should be within 24 hours, you'll take a super high dose of progesterone. Very, very, very high dose of progesterone. Higher than, like, the birth control pill. And so what happens is that super high dose of progesterone and then the sudden drop of progesterone messes with the body. Okay? So the high dose of progesterone, it's registered by your body, by the pituitary gland, by your ovaries. But then that progesterone leaves your blood very, very quickly. It's not going to be maintained by anything. And so that sudden drop of progesterone within the time period triggers menstruation. It triggers the release of the endometrium because, remember, a sudden drop in progesterone levels is what restarts your cycle. And so what you end up doing is kind of restarting your menstrual cycle. And if you do that, if fertilization had happened, if the egg had been fertilized and there's a chance you could be pregnant, you can't have pregnancy happen if there isn't an endometrium to allow implantation to occur. So it basically prevents pregnancy, an unwanted pregnancy, from happening by just triggering the restarting of the menstrual cycle and the loss of the endometrium by the sudden drop of progesterone. All right, so that's really how this works. It's pretty effective. Again, it's not guaranteed, but it is very effective that if something goes wrong, if for some reason any of the methods you might be using, there's something happens, do use this. All right, you shouldn't be using it all the time. You should be trying to use your contraceptives safely, because having such a high dose of progesterone and then having it drop, messing with your natural menstrual cycle, not such a great idea. It can have long-term negative effects on the female's body, but if something does go wrong, it is a way to help move the odds more in your favor that you don't actually become pregnant. So with the last two slides, just want to have a little bit of a discussion about the idea of contraceptives in society and where are they coming from and what is the debate about the use of them. And so really it comes down to this idea, are contraceptives a good thing or a bad thing? Different parts of the world have different views on whether or not this is okay, on whether or not we should be controlling reproduction, right? The idea of controlling or limiting people from getting pregnant. There are different cultures that have both positive and negative views of this. Mostly the pros are coming from this idea of using contraceptives. It's easier to control the population growth. So human beings, there is a limit to how many human beings on Earth can exist. The more people we put on Earth, the more strain we put on our food supply, our water supply, our global and personal economic plans. So we should be responsible. We should be able to decide when and if we will have children and how many children we might want to have. So it is a good thing to kind of control our own growth, right? To reduce the unwanted pregnancies. There are lots of children in the world who are orphans because they were unwanted pregnancies. The mothers did not want the children, they did not plan for the children, they did not think they could raise the children, possibly it would be a difficult family situation, or maybe the father abandoned the mother because of the pregnancies. Whatever the reasoning, they end up in an orphanage, they end up abandoned or possibly raised in a foster system rather than being raised in a regular family system, a regular home. So obviously we would want to reduce those unwanted pregnancies. Then you have instances where things don't work very well, contraceptives don't work, or rape happening, right? Obviously that would be very traumatizing if you were raped by somebody and then you're also pregnant, right? And so having different contraceptive methods, for example, like the Plan B pill or the morning after pill, to help deal with someone who's been raped, to help ensure that they don't get pregnant. This is something that we should have. This is something that we as a society that can make smart decisions and are capable of looking at the bigger picture of our lives and our effect on the world. This is a good thing for us to be able to do. The cons are varied, right? Removing major deterrent from sexual activity, right? The idea that you could get pregnant was a big influence on whether or not you even had sex at different points in your life. So teenage people going out and having sex with each other, obviously that's been happening for a long period of time. It's not a new thing that teenagers are trying to have sex. You're sexually active as you go through puberty. It kind of makes sense that you want to go and do the thing that your body is telling you that you should be doing. But obviously, a deterrent from people doing this or doing it too much was the idea that you could get pregnant. So if we greatly reduce the idea that someone can get pregnant, maybe we're increasing the probability that younger people are having disease, but they might be spreading sexually transmitted diseases if they're not doing it appropriately. Then the idea of promiscuity, the idea of people not valuing the action of sex, just seeing sex as something fun to do, seeing sex as, as something to fill their time when they're bored on the weekend, kind of devalues the act itself. The idea of promiscuity, of sleeping with multiple people, but not really having any emotional connection to those people or the act, that is looked down upon in various cultures around the world. The idea that sex can lead to increased diseases, as I said, and a lot of things, for example, like the pill, do not protect against those diseases. And so this is something that each of you need to think about as responsible adults. At what level do you think you need to be using contraceptives, and at what level will you be sexually active? When will you be sexually active? Obviously, this is your own decision, but I have to say as an educator that I do not think any of you should become sexually active if you are not mentally prepared for the idea of being pregnant and having a child, because that is a possibility. It can happen, and you need to know, be true to your own self. Are you capable of dealing with that responsibility in a mature way? Because if you are not, you should be limiting the chance that you'd have to deal with it by not having sex. Okay, so one more piece of information. This is not on the test, this is not the curriculum. I just think it's an interesting little piece of history, or possible history. It may or may not be true, but you might find it interesting. So most people probably, when they see this symbol, they are thinking of love, right? Of internal love. They're thinking of Valentine's Day love, right? And it's a heart, right? It's shaped kind of like our human heart, but not really. There isn't really the best comparison between this and the shape of a human heart, right? And so we look at diagrams of the heart. There's some similarity, but it's not that great. So where does the symbol really come from? Is it based on the human heart, or is it possibly coming from something else? Well, there's a chance that this doesn't actually mean eternal love, and originally doesn't mean eternal love. It doesn't come from our hearts and our connection for deep love for each other, the way that we might feel it today. There's a good chance that this actually is a symbol that represents sex and promiscuity and deep lust for individual, or the idea of having sex without any consequences, because this symbol has a good chance that it is actually based on this. You guys see the similarities in that shape? No? So that is actually the seed of a particular plant, a particular type of xylophilium plant. And the particular species that we're referring to was very common in the Roman age, which is the time period that the heart symbol seems to have become more common in records of things. So the heart symbol, it's been around for a very long time, might have been based on the shape of this seed. And the reason why is because the chemicals released by the seed were actually a natural contraceptive. Which chemical or how it actually affected the act of sex isn't really well understood. But it is believed from writings from at the time that consuming large amounts of the seeds would actually stop you from getting pregnant. And so it was a natural contraceptive. You could eat this and then you could go have sex and you wouldn't have to worry about having children or getting pregnant. So that symbol connecting to this seed is more connected to the idea of we can have sex as much as we want and we don't really need to worry about children. So that would be more an idea of lust rather than this idea of like deep love and affection. So why are we using it today? Well, because it's extinct. So remember, the Romans, if this is true, they're eating the seed of the plant, right? So the seed is the reproductive part of the plant. That's the part that you need to plant in the ground in order to make a new one. So if people are eating all of these seeds and then aren't necessarily doing enough replanting, then there's a chance that the species would actually go extinct. And that's what we think may have happened. We might have eaten the seeds of the species to the point of extinction. So that's why we don't really have the ability to really study the plant, know exactly if it is true, if it was actually like causing contraceptive changes, if it was some type of chemical change that altered the ability for pregnancy to occur, just because it doesn't exist anymore. It's now extinct. But again, it's not part of the class. It's not part of the curriculum. Just a little interesting thing that you can have in the back of your head.